Hi everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. So today we're going to talk about something called the law of mirrors. But as always, welcome back to this channel. And as always, before I get into what exactly this law of mirrors is, please, if you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up and please do subscribe. Very thankful for my current subscribers, because you've actually been not only it's been an incredible conversation about survivorship, but also like the video suggestions and other suggestions have been amazing. So let's keep this community growing. Now, talking about narcissism as I do, and trying to help people through narcissistic abuse can often feel like fighting a wildfire, big wildfire, which splinters into lots of little spot fires. Just when you think you have containment on the big fire, the little ones keep on burning and you can't get all of the fires put out. So you just do your best, which is I'm realizing is all that I can do is just kind of keep trying to keep the spot fires and the big fire managed as well as I can. So I actually just got an email, and I'm just gonna, I'm actually not even gonna use a first initial on this one because I really do try to keep emailers and commenters safe. So you know who you are. Thank you. This person brought up something I had never heard of called the law of mirrors. I'm going to be frank with you, I am not up to speed on a lot of this new age stuff, but I went and I did a bit of a deep dive, and the more I read about it, the more I recognize that this so-called law of mirrors makes people, one more thing to make people more vulnerable to narcissists, and is actually a concept that's likely often weaponized by narcissistic people. What's interesting is that some of these sorts of new age principles often have like a seed of, I don't know, believability. And the law of mirrors appears to be like that. But the fact is, in the hands of a narcissistic person, these principles often get commandeered into tools that can be harmful. So I dug as much as I could. I guess, again, this isn't like, it's not like in psychological writings, but it appears that the fundamental basis of the law of mirrors is that all of the feelings you have for or about somebody else come from you. And I get that part of it. Our feelings are ours. We take responsibility for our feelings. But then the law of mirrors goes on to say that anything that you recognize or comment on in another person, it implies that you carry those qualities as well. So, if I were to notice entitlement in another person, the law of mirrors would say, I'm entitled. So does that make sense? When I read about this, I was like, ooh, 2 words for you, not good. Because obviously that means, according to this law of mirrors, if someone recognizes narcissistic patterns or gaslighting or invalidation or lack of empathy or entitlement or superficiality or victimhood or contempt in another person, according to this so-called law of mirrors, by you noticing or recognizing that in another person, then that means that you're the one who's narcissistic or gaslighting or invalidating or not empathic, etc., yourself. F no. I want to curse so bad. No. And once I started going down this very deep rabbit hole of law of mirrors and cursing a lot, I found myself in a rather confusing and distorted house of mirrors, to be frank with you. I kind of chuckled ironically, in between cursing, to myself as I read this stuff and recognized that this law of mirrors type stuff is exactly what narcissistic people use against other people who are foolhardy enough to call out a narcissistic or gaslighting person. Because what do they often say? Oh, if you think that about me, then you must be the narcissist. How many of you have heard that? Drop a comment on that one. Or making this even less mature. When I was a kid, it reminds me of what we would run around saying about, like, if you passed gas as a child, right? If you smelt it, you dealt it. The law of mirrors seems to be vibing at about that level. But this kind of thinking basically keeps a person in a narcissistic relationship somewhat imprisoned, and quite manipulated while they're in that toxic relationship. Because basically what it's saying is if you recognize it, as I said, according to this so-called law of mirrors, that means that you might be the narcissist. And what does that do for people who are stuck in these relationships? It may push people further into the shadows, further doubting their instincts and thinking, wow, I knew I wasn't a really good person. I really am a dark-hearted person who is an unempathic, narcissistic gaslighter because I see it in someone else. One thing we do know about people who have been through trauma or narcissistic abuse or any kind of antagonistic relationship abuse, they not only blame themselves, but over time, they actually start to view themselves as awful people. This law of mirrors really, really reinforces that. Now, I gotta be honest with you, I'm a bit of a science geek, and I tend to be pretty conservative on what I consider to be sort of allowable as laws of nature. I mean, I sort of kind of a purist and a physics gal when it comes to this stuff, and sort of believe that there's probably only really the law of gravity. I might say in psychology there's the law of effect, there's the law of motion. So I think even calling this a law of mirrors is already a bit grandiose. So let's put this law to bed once and for all, shall we? My goal in teaching people about antagonistic patterns and how they impact us, antagonistic patterns such as narcissism, is so that they can stop blaming themselves for another person invalidating them or for another person's careless, unkind, and unempathic behavior. This law of mirrors type stuff basically blocks the ability for people to apply any of this information they're learning about narcissism. I really have to wonder about the personality states of the people who put this kind of law of mirrors out there, because as far as I can see it, the law of mirrors can often serve to silence and shame people. Some people may believe that the law of mirrors is meant to be some prism that allows us to see our darkness because we identify it in another person. That doesn't work, because in so sort of doing this, we are forever stuck at an impasse, perhaps forever thinking that our observations about people are a reflection of our damaged selves. That seems really limiting. When a narcissistic person is doing their narcissistic thing, they're going to encounter one of three kinds of people. Number one, they're going to encounter either, one, other narcissists. Ironically, they might either really notice the other narcissist's behavior or not notice it at all, depending on whether that other narcissist's behavior works for them. Or number two, they will encounter enablers who they always keep around because they just keep pumping the narcissistic people full of air to maintain the status quo, maybe for reasons of fear or naivete or ignorance. Or number three, it's the people that they narcissistically abuse. People who have been taking the psychological punches for weeks, months, or even years, who didn't quite get it, and who may now finally get it. So this law of mirrors is telling this third group, the people experiencing the narcissistic abuse, that if you dare call out the narcissist, then it means that you are narcissistic. So what does it do then? It gaslights and shames the survivors even more. The idea that noticing something in someone reflects it in ourselves is a load of crap. For many survivors who walk around confused for years and decades and don't call it out, but can't understand why in this relationship they are always confused and anxious and hopeless and self-doubting and ruminating. They didn't call it out or even recognize it for years, and all it did was push them further into the shadows. But when a person may find their voice and maybe call it out, maybe not even to the narcissist, but even to someone else, this damn law of mirrors is now telling them that just as they find their voices, that they are the narcissist for calling it out, that is not acceptable to me. I have made no secret about my concerns about sort of new agey magical thinking kind of stuff, such as manifesting and other similar practices that may wind up blaming people for their narcissistic relationships. People who are in narcissistic relationships have been told things like, well, I guess you manifested this, or your darkness attracted this. And now this law of mirrors is one more place where narcissistic folks are commandeering the agenda and basically sort of ending any possibility of recognition about a toxic pattern that someone's stuck in, which would then empower that person to set a boundary or get the hell out of the relationship. I gotta say, as I read all this law of mirror stuff, I did see some perky folks out there trying to find the positive aspects of the law of mirrors. They would say things like, oh, the law of mirrors are great. It's just teaching me about myself. What I see is that a narcissistic person who believes in this or accesses it will use it to further confuse a partner or a family member or a friend who is likely already blaming themselves. And then, by framing it as some sort of law, the narcissistic or antagonistic person can then just keep gaslighting away. And if you suggest that they are gaslighting, they can simply play the game that, well, if you see it that way, then you must be the gaslighter. This new age law of mirrors, definitely reinforces one of the actual principles. I am not so arrogant as to call it a law about interacting with narcissists. You can't, what have I always said? Rule number one with narcissists, you can't call narcissists out, because if you do, you may get them using this so-called law of mirrors to tell them, for them to tell you that you are the narcissist. They may not even know about the law of mirrors, but that's what they tend to do either way. I guess now it has a name. The trick to learning this knowledge, the reason I want all of you to know about narcissism is so you can use it like a Jedi. Learn it, know it, and once you detect narcissism or you recognize the patterns, to distance yourself from it quietly, wisely, and you slowly fade back, so slowly that the narcissistic person doesn't recognize that you have pulled back on the supply. Because that's really all you've ever been to them. That's all anyone else is to them. A source of validation, a source of supply, and a way that they're able to regulate themselves. I'm going to be honest with you. Just because someone says something is a law doesn't make it so. So to the person who sent this in, it's a reminder to all of you, you send this stuff in, I take it seriously. So to that person out there, thank you. I'm glad I learned about the law of mirrors. Let's all of us try to stay a step ahead of this stuff, because it's going to be essential for everyone to know the tricks in the book so you know them before they're used on you. Thanks again.